A man who survived thousands of swords, crushed 3 rival empires, and stitched the civilized world with his own hands should not die because of a piece of paper. The year is 275 AD. The Roman Empire was on the brink of total collapse, fragmented into 3 bloody pieces, and ruled by the absolute chaos of the 3rd century crisis. Barbarian invaders were tearing through northern borders, while usurpers crowned themselves in distant provinces. Everything seemed lost in the darkness of history. Dust covered Rome. Hope had died. It was then that Aurelian emerged, a soldier of humble origins who rose to the throne with the force of a relentless hurricane. He was not a soft-spoken politician, but a formidable military predator. In just 5 years, he marched from one end of the known world to the other. He annihilated the Gallic Empire in the west. He crushed the Palmyrene Empire in the east. He rebuilt the walls of the eternal capital. He marched. Rome survived. The Senate acclaimed him with the supreme title of Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian's glory was so blinding that his enemies trembled just hearing the sound of his legion's boots marching on the dry earth. He was considered an avatar of the sun god himself on earth. No enemy blade seemed capable of piercing his blessed armor. No conspiracy of arrogant senators managed to topple his iron reign. He was the invincible titan who had rescued civilization from the edge of the abyss. Immortality seemed his only possible destiny. The legend was forged. The world breathed a sigh of relief. However, the most brutal irony of classical antiquity was about to unfold in the twilight of an isolated military tent. The man who could not be stopped by entire armies would be brought down by the silent fear of an insignificant bureaucrat. But what happens when the most dangerous men in the world see their own names written in the ink of a ghost? The damp and freezing wind of Thrace howled mercilessly across the desolate plains of Caenophrurium, a forgotten spot on the map that would soon become the epicenter of a monumental tragedy. The Roman military camp stretched as far as the eye could see, forming a veritable city of canvas, leather, and sharpened steel. Thousands of tents flapped violently against the gusts of freezing air blowing from the Black Sea. The smell of green wood smoke mingled with the metallic odor of weapons being polished and the sweat of restless war horses. They were not there by chance. The setting was one of war. The tension was palpable. Aurelian had gathered the most devastating military force of his era, composed of veterans hardened by countless brutal campaigns. The goal was clear and ambitious. They were marching east, preparing to invade the powerful Sassanid Empire and avenge old Roman defeats. The war machine was perfectly oiled and ready for the massacre. Discipline was the law. Error was death. The geographic isolation of this camp created a pressure cooker atmosphere, where news did not arrive and rumors spread like wildfire. Far from the marble palaces of Rome, the only absolute authority was the word of the emperor. The soldiers marched in thick mud, faces marked by the cold and unquestioning loyalty to their supreme commander. Every movement was timed. Every breath seemed controlled by the stern gaze of the centurions patrolling the corridors between the tents. The military power concentrated there was enough to topple mountains and dry up rivers. No one dared to question the orders. The machine was waiting. The empire was watching. The grandeur of that expeditionary force reflected the soul of its iron leader. But beneath the rigid discipline of this invincible camp, a silent poison was already beginning to drip into the minds of the Roman military elite. At the heart of this formidable war machine pulsed the life and suffering of real men, such as Mucapor, a 45-year-old general of the Praetorian Guard. Mucapor's body was a living parchment of extreme loyalty, covered in deep scars earned in the burning sands of Palmyra and the frozen forests of Gaul. He had bled for the emperor. He had killed for the emperor. His devotion was absolute. Loyalty was blind. Mucapor knew the weight of the sword and the cost of Roman glory. Yet his unwavering loyalty shared space with a paralyzing psychological terror that consumed his mind every night. Aurelian was not a benevolent leader. In the corridors of the camp, veterans called him in whispers Manu ad Ferrum, the man with his hand on the sword. The emperor was famous for his relentless discipline and draconian punishments. He did not forgive weaknesses. He did not accept excuses. A small logistical failure, a minimal delay, or a rumor of insubordination resulted in summary and brutal executions in front of the entire legion. Mukapa's life was a constant walk on the edge of a rusty razor. Fear was real. Death was near. Daily life in camp reflected this crushing tension, where the sound of hurried footsteps outside the tent could mean the arrival of a messenger with an execution order. Mukapor drank his bitter wine in the gloom, watching shadows dance on the canvas walls, knowing that any day could be his last if the emperor's wrath turned against him. The greatness of Rome was built on the bones of its enemies and the dread of its own generals. The air was heavy. The silence was deafening. Every soldier slept with one eye open, fearing both the Persians on the horizon and the furious judgment of their own leader. And it would be exactly this blind loyalty, poisoned by absolute terror, that the true assassin would use as his sharpest blade. While elite generals sharpened their swords and endured the psychological terror of discipline, the true threat lay hidden in the fragility of bureaucratic work. Eros, also known as Mnestius, was an imperial secretary in charge of the camp's complex finances and correspondence. He was not a warrior. He had no battle scars. His soft hands knew only the touch of papyrus, ink, and the gold coins of the military treasury. Eros had made a fatal and microscopic mistake. He had lied about a small administrative embezzlement and insignificant corruption by Rome's standards. But the emperor found out. Aurelian's fury was imminent. Eros knew there would be no trial, only a brutal and humiliating execution. Panic gripped his soul. His breathing quickened, cold sweat trickled down. Alone in his dark tent, lit only by the flickering glow of a tallow candle, Eros made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not flee to the frozen plains of Thrace, for he would be hunted like an animal. He would use the only weapon he knew how to wield with mastery. The pen scratched. The papyrus accepted the lie. With a skill born of absolute desperation, the secretary forged Emperor Aurelian's unmistakable handwriting. He forged a secret list of imminent executions. To give the document unquestionable credibility, Eros included his own name at the top of the death row list. Then, his hands trembling violently, he added the names of the empire's most loyal and powerful generals, including the veteran Mukapor. The trap was set. The ink dried slowly. The contrast was disturbing. A cornered bureaucrat, driven purely by cowardice and animal survival instinct, had just created an instrument of mass destruction. The entire empire was about to crumble because of the lie of a coin thief. The cursed papyrus was ready, but for the lie to turn into blood, it needed to find the eyes of those who feared death the most. The darkness of the night swallowed the camp when Eros, feigning absolute panic and tears of despair, ran to the tents of the superior officers. He delivered the forged scroll into the calloused hands of Mukapor and the other generals of the Praetorian Guard. The silence that followed was the sound of the world collapsing. The eyes of the veterans swept over the document. They saw their names next to the secretary's name. The initial shock quickly turned into a consuming paranoia. The dark genius of Eros's lie lay in its frightening verisimilitude. The generals did not doubt the document's authenticity because the execution order matched Aurelian's relentless and cruel personality perfectly. They knew that the emperor was capable of bloody purges without any prior warning. The instinct for survival spoke louder than a lifetime's loyalty. Reason vanished. Dread took control. There was no time for questioning, investigation, or appeals for leniency. If they waited until dawn, their heads would be rolling in the mud of Caenophrurium. In a trance induced by irrational fear, the elite officers made the heaviest decision of their lives. They needed to strike first. They unsheathed their swords in silence. The death march began. The heavy steps of the generals echoed on the frozen ground as they headed toward Aurelian's command tent. The guards, seeing their own commanders approaching, made way without suspecting anything. The emperor was alone, unarmed, reviewing maps by lamplight when the men he trusted most stormed the chamber. There was no glorious duel. There was no epic speech. Blades flashed. The savior fell. The man who had reunified the civilized world was brutally stabbed to death by his own friends, who wept in despair as they sank the steel into his chest. The emperor's bloody body cooled quickly on the dirt floor, but the true tragedy of this night of horrors was still hidden in the camp's shadows. The morning sun illuminated the pool of blood in the Imperial tent, revealing the staggering extent of the mistake that had changed the course of history. When the emperor's belongings were reviewed, the truth came to light with overwhelming cruelty. There was no real execution list. The parchment was a cheap forgery. Aurelian's loyalty to his generals had never wavered. The most lethal army in the world fell to its knees in the mud. Grief ripped through the camp. Scarred men cried like helpless children as they realized they had cowardly murdered the greatest leader Rome had ever known, manipulated by the fear of a corrupt secretary. The fury of the legions turned against Eros, who was captured, dragged, and tied to a post to be devoured alive by wild beasts. But vengeance could not resurrect the restorer of the world. Justice was done. The empire wept. In an unprecedented display of mourning in Roman history, the same assassins built a monumental tomb for the man they had just betrayed, spending fortunes to honor the memory of the one they themselves had killed. The empire plunged again into a period of mourning and uncertainty, proving that the military greatness of an entire civilization can be undone in a single second by the weakness of the human mind. Rome's walls had been saved by Aurelian's sword, but his heart stopped because of the scratching of a pen poisoned by cowardice. Supreme power is an illusion that dissolves in the air. History is not written only by heroes in shining armor, but often destroyed by cowards trembling in the shadows of anonymity. Subscribe to this channel and join our legion of timeless observers before the next lie erases your name from history forever.